In January 2018, a film that had been locked in a vault for 46 years played in a public theater for the first time. Aretha Franklin was not there. She was too ill to attend. The woman whose voice was at the center of every frame, whose performance had made grown men weep in a Los Angeles church in 1972, sat at home in Detroit while strangers watched the most private thing she had ever recorded. 8 months later, she was gone. The film was called Amazing Grace, and the story of why it took 46 years to reach an audience is the story of a woman who understood something about her own work that almost nobody else did, and then, at the very end, let it go. Aretha Louise Franklin was born on March 25, 1942, in Memphis, Tennessee, the fourth child of Barbara Siggers Franklin and the Reverend Clarence LaVaughn Franklin, known to his congregation and to gospel music lovers across America as C.L. Franklin. C.L. Franklin was not an ordinary minister. He was a phenomenon. His sermons were recorded and sold on vinyl records. He pastored New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit, where the pews held over 4,000 people on a Sunday morning, and the line to get in sometimes wrapped around the block. His voice was so admired that people drove hundreds of miles to hear him preach. Aretha grew up inside that sound. Not beside it, inside it. She sang in her father's church as a child. She sang at the funerals of people she had never met, because her voice was already something that exceeded ordinary understanding. Clara Ward, the great gospel singer and a close family friend, was present at New Bethel when Aretha was a girl and wept the first time she heard young Aretha sing. Mahalia Jackson came to the Franklin home. Sam Cooke came. James Cleveland, who would become one of the most influential gospel musicians of his generation, was a regular presence in Aretha's early life. A mentor, an accompanist, a witness to what was developing. At 14, Aretha Franklin recorded her first gospel album for Chess Records. At 18, she left Detroit for New York and signed with Columbia Records. The Columbia years were long and largely wrong. 9 years. Multiple albums, real talent repeatedly buried under arrangements that did not understand what they were working with. The producers wanted to make her a jazz singer, a pop singer, a sophisticated cabaret artist. None of those frames fit. She was not difficult to produce. She was impossible to misuse. And they managed it anyway. In 1966, she left Columbia. She signed with Atlantic Records. She went to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, sat down at a piano in a small studio, and within the first session, everything that had been obscured for 9 years became audible. In 1967, respect entered the national conversation. It was not just a song. It was a statement, a demand, an anthem, and a demonstration, all in the space of 2 minutes and 28 seconds. Chain of Fools. Think. I Say a Little Prayer. Natural Woman. Between 1967 and 1969, Aretha Franklin released a sequence of recordings that did not merely top the charts. They redefined what popular music could carry, what a voice was allowed to mean in the context of a culture in conflict with itself. She won 2 Grammy Awards in 1968, 2 more in 1969. She was named the Queen of Soul by the city of Detroit. A street bore her name while she was still in her 20s. And through all of it, she never left the church. Not spiritually, not musically, not emotionally. In January 1972, Aretha Franklin walked back into a church to make a record. Not a crossover album, not a secular recording with gospel touches, a gospel record, a real one, pure gospel, recorded live over 2 nights at New Temple Missionary Baptist Church in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. The pastor of New Temple was James Cleveland, the same James Cleveland who had played piano in the Franklin home in Detroit when Aretha was a girl. He led the Southern California Community Choir. They filled the choir loft with 40 voices. The congregation filled every pew. The session was produced by Jerry Wexler, and Sidney Pollack arrived with a film crew. Pollack was already a respected Hollywood director in 1972. He would go on to make The Way We Were, Tootsie, and Out of Africa. He had been commissioned to document the recording sessions on film, to capture not just the music, but the room, the people, the specific atmosphere of what happened when Aretha Franklin returned to the music she had grown up in. On the nights of January 13th and 14th, 1972, the cameras rolled. What happened over those 2 nights was something that nobody in the room was fully prepared for. Aretha sat down at the piano. James Cleveland settled beside her. The choir rose. The congregation leaned forward. And then Aretha Franklin began to sing. She sang, "Mary, Don't You Weep." She sang, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand." She sang, "How I Got Over." She sang the title piece, "Amazing Grace." And when she finished, there was a long moment in which the room could not respond. The congregation had been there. They had watched it happen. And they still could not immediately process what they had just heard. Mick Jagger was in those pews on both nights. He sat in a gospel church in Watts in January 1972 and watched Aretha Franklin sing. He would say later that he had never experienced anything quite like it. The Rolling Stones were at the peak of their cultural reach. He had played Altamont less than 3 years earlier. He had performed in front of 300,000 people, and he sat in that church and could not look away. Charlie Watts was with him. Both of them watched from the pews like ordinary members of a congregation who had wandered into something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. Sidney Pollack filmed all of it. There was one problem. He had not used a clapperboard. In film production, a clapperboard provides synchronization. The sharp visual snap of the board matches the sharp sound on the audio track, giving an editor a reference point that locks image to sound. Without it, matching what the camera sees to what the microphone recorded becomes not just difficult, but, with the technology of 1972, effectively impossible. Pollack's footage could not be synced to the audio. The film was shelved. The album was released in June 1972. It sold over 2 million copies in its first year. It became the best-selling gospel record in the history of the format at that time. It won 2 Grammy Awards. Critics called it a masterpiece of American sacred music. The film sat in a vault. Years passed, then decades. In the 1990s and early 2000s, digital restoration technology had advanced to the point where the synchronization problem was theoretically solvable. The technical obstacle that had stopped Pollack in 1972 was no longer the barrier it had been. A documentary producer named Alan Elliott acquired the rights to the footage and began the painstaking process of restoring and syncing 46-year-old film. Aretha Franklin sued to stop him. In 2011, her lawyers obtained a court injunction preventing any release of the film. She offered no detailed public explanation. The injunction held. In 2015, Elliott arranged for the film to be screened at a small number of film festivals, a quiet debut meant to test the waters. Aretha's lawyers returned to court. The screenings were halted. For 46 years, she had the legal power to keep this from the world, and she used it consistently, deliberately, and without apparent regret. People speculated about why. Some believed she was protecting the sacredness of the recording, that a gospel performance in a church was not meant to be entertainment, not meant to be watched in a theater by people who had paid for a ticket. Some believed the film revealed something interior, something stripped and unguarded in a way that the audio recording alone did not. Aretha Franklin on record was extraordinary. Aretha Franklin on film, in a church, in the specific atmosphere of those 2 January nights, was something else, something that could not be separated from the private and the holy in the way that a studio album could be. Whatever her reasoning, she held firm. Then, in 2017, something changed. Aretha Franklin reduced her public appearances. She canceled performances. In 2018, it would be confirmed publicly that she had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The life that had seemed indestructible, the voice that had seemed permanent, was revealing itself as finite. She agreed to release the film. She never explained why she changed her mind. Amazing Grace premiered at Doc NYC in November 2018. Aretha Franklin had died on August 16, 2018, at her home in Detroit. She was 76 years old. She had agreed to let the film go. She had not lived to see it play in a theater. When the film went into wider release in the spring of 2019, critics were not prepared for what they encountered. They had heard the album, they knew the songs, they knew the story of the recording sessions, but seeing Aretha at the piano in that church, seeing her face when the music moved through her, seeing the congregation respond in real time, seeing James Cleveland weeping beside her, seeing Mick Jagger in the pew, was an experience of a different order entirely. Roger Ebert's publication gave it 4 stars. The Guardian called it one of the greatest concert films ever made. The New York Times said it was a document of a kind of greatness that could not be manufactured or explained, only witnessed. Aretha Franklin had spent 46 years preventing the world from witnessing it. Then she let go. There are different ways to understand that decision. She may have wanted control over her image, over how her sacredness was presented, over what the public was permitted to see of the private and the holy. She may have believed for decades that some performances were not meant for general consumption, that they belonged to the room in which they were made. And then, at the end, perhaps she understood something else, that a performance given from that deep a place does not ultimately belong to the performer. The church where those 2 nights happened still stands in Los Angeles. The choir loft is still there. The pews that held Mick Jagger and 400 congregants and the full Southern California Community Choir are still there. And now the film plays. Aretha sits at the piano. She is 30 years old. She has no idea she will spend the next 46 years trying to keep this from being seen. She also has no idea that the moment is stronger than she is. Some things get out eventually. Subscribe to Untold Soul Legends. Every week, we find the moments behind the music that changed everything. The comments section is open. Tell us, which Soul Legend story do you want to hear next? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needed to hear it today.